Hello everyone to Superunited Rapid 2025. We have today Gukesh versus Caruana in a battle of generation, sharp minds, bold idea, and no room for error. Gukesh started with knight f3, and Caruana thinking, he played d5, g3 by Gukesh, and we have knight f6, bishop g2, and e6, c4. We have a ready opening by Gukesh as usual, bishop e7 and b3, castled by Caruana Fabiano, and bishop b2. Now we have c5, c takes d5, and knight takes d5. Knight c3, knight c6, and we have h4 by Gukesh, and knight came back to f6. Castled by Gukesh, e5, rook c1, and we have bishop f5 by Fabiano, d3, rook c8. Now the best move for Gukesh to move his knight on c3 to e4 or a4, but instead he played knight d2, and we have bishop e6. Knight wants to come to c4. Now knight c4 on the board, so knight came to g4, and we have e3, h5, queen came to e2, e6, rook f d1, b5, knight came back to d2, f5, and suddenly Fabiano controlling all the board. Knight came to f3, but the bishop on e6 now hanging, so he played bishop f6. This is a blunder. Now Gukesh can play d4 because the queen can take bishop on e6, and played d4 by Gukesh. Now e5, and Gukesh played d5, so pawn takes knight on f3, and bishop takes pawn on f3. Knight came to e5, and pawn takes bishop on e6. Knight takes bishop, and queen takes knight, and we have queen on e7. So knight d4, queens take pawn, and bishop takes bishop. And now Gukesh is better, so knight takes bishop on f6, knight, and now a good tactic by Gukesh, queens take f5, queens take queen, and knight e7 check fork, queen and king, so knight takes queen, and we have rook c7. Knight came to d6, rook d8, pawn pushed to e4, and rook c to d7, and we have e5 kicking the knight. Knight came to e4, and we have rook e1, and knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and now Gukesh will win the pawn on c5 if you take my pawn on d3. So Fabiano move his rook to c8, and now Gukesh can move his rook to e5. Yes, he played it. Rook e5, king came to h6, and rook c takes c5, rook takes rook, and rook takes rook, and now Gukesh have one pawn more than Fabiano. So king came to f1 or rook e6. He don't want the white king to come to the king side. So we have a4 by Gukesh, pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn. We have now g6, and the position is winning for Gukesh. a5, king g7, and we have king g2, rook f6, and check from c2, king came to h6, and rook came behind the pawn on e6, rook c6, and finally the king came to f3, rook e6, king f4, and rook to c6, and now nothing can do by Fabiano. He cannot move his king, he cannot push his pawn. He will play only with his rook. So king came to e4, and rook came to e6 with check. King came to d4, check from d6, completely winning for the white. King came to c5, and rook came to d2, f4, rook c2 check, and king came back to d5, rook on d2 check, and the king came to e5 check from e2, and king came back to d5 check from d2, and the king finally came to c6. So rook d3, and rook takes pawn on a6, and rook takes pawn on g3. So king came to b7, and now ready to push his pawn. Rook came to f3, and rook came to e6, protecting his pawn and ready to push his pawn to e6. So king came to g7, and rook came to c6. Rook takes pawn on f4, and now he pushes pawn to a6, and cannot check with the rook from f7 or b4 because he will cover with the rook. Finally Fabiano resigned. Very good game by Gukesh. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget like, subscribe. See you in the next video. Goodbye.